Thank you for joining today's webinar on peaceful coexistence, the facts about pensions and education funding. My name is Hank Kim. I'm the Executive Director of the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. In today's webinar, we will provide an overview of a recent research publication on whether paying employer contributions to public pensions takes away from other state priorities like education and public safety. Leading us in today's webinar is Dr. Michael Kahn, NCPERS Director of Research. We encourage audience participation. Please submit questions by using the GoToMeetings portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics, we will hold your questions till the last part of the program. Michael, I'll turn over the webinar to you now.
Thank you, Hank, and thank you everybody for participating in our webinar. Since I'm a researcher, I thought I'll just say a few words about research itself. Research is an exercise about finding the truth, finding the facts. And finding the truth has become actually more important in this age of information and digital age. Digital age has many benefits, but it also become a source of lot of misinformation. If people hear something like taxpayers can't afford public pensions 6 times, they begin to believe it. So credible research is an important tool for us to separate facts from misinformation. By credible research, I mean it uses standard research methodology and data, most probably publicly available data, and credible research should be replicable. Anybody should be able to do and get the same results, and credible research should be reviewed by other experts in the subject, like a peer review. So the research I'm going to present has gone through followed all of those steps. It's been peer reviewed, and it's been blessed by some of the best known people in the country. So let me speak about today's topic, and I'll add other research we have done in this context. So before I begin, I want to really set the context of today's discussion, and that's pretty much captured in this slide. Look at the first bullet point. There was a time in America when if you had a job, you had a pension. Now only about 1 out of 10 workers, especially in private sector, have pension. If you work in public sector, there is still a decent chance that you have pension. But public pensions are now under constant attack by those who would like to see pensions converted into do-it-yourself retirement savings plans, such as 401k type defined contribution plans. So it leaves people pretty much on their own. So opponents of public pensions make 2 arguments. To convert defined benefit pensions into do-it-yourself defined contribution plans. So the first they argue that pensions are crowding out other public services such as education. And you may have seen in the news media or in publication, this is one example, pension contributions crowding out public services across California. So a lot of these studies are focused on California. And the second argument that's often made to undermine public pensions is taxpayers can't afford public pensions. And again, you'll see articles in the news media talking about that. So let's examine the facts about these two attacks, sort of attacks on public pensions. So to address the issue of whether the public pension contribution by employer are crowding out other services such as public education. So this particular publication examines that issue. So are pensions crowding out education funding? So we looked at about almost a quarter century of data, and you can see on this chart the blue line shows expenditures are funding for public education. That's the top line, and the red line at the bottom is the pension contribution or spending by state and local governments on pensions. And you can see that the two lines, as you go from 1990 onward toward the latest years, the distance at the top becomes larger. So they are on a different trajectories. So by crowding out, if it was crowding out, these lines should be coming closer. So we looked at using a best fit regression model to draw these slopes. So we looked at the slope of each of these lines, and you can see the slope of funding for education is much steeper than the slope of the pension contribution line, which is the bottom line. So this really indicates there isn't any crowding out because the lines are really moving apart. If there was crowding out, they should be converging instead of diverging from each other. Of course, the slope of education funding line being steeper doesn't really mean that funding for education is adequate and equitable. In fact, many state Supreme Courts have ruled that education funding in various states are inadequate and inequitable and do not conform to the state constitution to provide equal opportunity to children regardless of their life circumstances. So there is really, it's not an indication that funding is adequate and equitable, but it is, the line is steeper, but mainly showing that there is no crowding out effect that is we saw in the news article that I just showed you earlier. So how about other services? Here we look at other services expenditure on education as well as healthcare, public safety, and pensions from 1993 to 2016, almost the same time period for which the latest data is available. So here again, you can see the lines. The blue line is education. The sort of red one is healthcare. The green triangles are public safety, and the bottom line uh, uh, crosses line. The last line at the bottom is pension contribution. So none of these lines are converging. They have different slopes, but they are not converging to show the crowding out effect. So, and again, I should caution that this doesn't mean that the funding is appropriate or there's no budget pressures. If there is a squeeze on state, there is certainly squeeze on state and local budgets and the state and local revenues. And it's because of these state and local revenues being out of sync with the economy. So next slide sort of shows as shows that uh, the the two lines, the top line is economy, which is measured by personal income on which most of the taxes are based. So the blue line at the top is the economic growth, and we are looking at data were available for almost like 40 years. So we are looking at this for a long period of time, and you could see the top line economy of the state and local governments, very steep line compared to the tax revenues line, which is the bottom line, the red line, which is sort of lagging behind. It doesn't grow as fast as the economy. So a good revenue system should really capture the economic growth. So why is that? Let's examine. Actually, I talk about this subject. Uh, why do revenues lag economy? And the reason is state and local revenue system over the years have become out of sync with the economy. In good economic times, policymakers cut progressive and stable taxes, and bad economic times, they fill the budget gap with volatile and risky revenue schemes such as casinos, lotteries, user fees, excise taxes like cigarette tax, things like that. So through these, on top of that, state and local governments have given away revenue through tax loopholes and subsidies in the name of economic development. So through these loopholes and subsidies, state revenues flow out of state and sometimes overseas tax havens. So instead of blaming pensions for budget squeeze or crowding out of other services, we really need to work together to address the underlying revenue problems. And I should mention, by the way, our next webinar is actually going to focus on strategies for pension advocates to address the revenue issues. That's the bottom line for funding all of the services, not just pensions. So I mentioned in the beginning there are two arguments used to undermine public pension. One was this crowding out, which we have discussed. And I wanted to uh, talk about the second line of attack, I should say, is the taxpayers can't afford. So let's examine, can taxpayers afford public pensions? Here we have recently, a year ago, published uh, unintended consequences publication, which actually addressed that particular question. So NCPERS 2018 studies, unintended consequences, shows that public pensions are net revenue contributors. That's what we found through our research. Again, this piece of research was peer-reviewed and based on the publicly available data. So the bottom line is, were there no public pensions, taxpayers will have to pay $137 billion more to get the same level of services. That's how much public pensions actually contribute to state and local revenues. And let me show you how we came up with this number 137 billion net revenue gain because of public pension. So public pensions impact economy and revenue in two ways. First is the investment of pension fund assets that contributed to economy 587 billion, and that resulted in 125 billion in state and local revenues. So you can see the two bar charts. On the left is the economy, and on the right is the revenue. 125 billion as a result of investment of public pension assets, although they are not uh, invested in state, and they are invested globally sometimes, emerging markets, but the impact can be traced down to each individual state. So in actual publication, you will find your own state, not only for this particular subject, but the subject I had discussed before, which was the crowding out effect. You could see for each of the states. So you can look up for your own state. Going to the next slide, the second way public pensions contribute to economy and revenue is through spending of pension checks. And here you will see the impact of spending of checks was $757 billion. That resulted in 151 billion in state and local revenue. So now we compare this total revenue generated because of existence of public pensions and compare that to the taxpayer contribution to pensions. So this was in 2016. We had $277 billion total from the previous two charts coming into state treasuries, and how much state and local governments paid? 140.3 billion. So if you minus these two numbers, you get 137. So these were the two main lines of attack, but beyond the two main arguments discussed so far, some people argue that public pensions are in crisis. And you probably heard that one also in your reading the newspapers or in your discussions. So here we have a new study which was featured in Governing magazine, really asking the question, what crisis? And this study is actually based on research done recently by researchers at Bank of England, Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and Brookings institutions. And we actually had a presentation of these studies, and those of you who attended the Public Pension Funding Forum in New York in September may have heard this presentation from Byron Lutz from Federal Reserve Bank. So this study argues that when we analyze pensions from unfunded liability perspective, we find that pensions might be in crisis. But when we look at pensions from a fiscal perspective, it's not much of a crisis. So the study finds that under low and moderate asset returns, pension debt can be stabilized for the next 40 years with modest fiscal adjustments, which have already taken place in many states where they have increased employee contributions as well as, and by stabilization, really the authors mean that the ratio between the state debt, including pension debt, and the state's GDP, state gross state product, is stabilized, is not increasing. So with these modest adjustments which have already been made, the state and local pension funds can be stabilized, fiscally stabilized. It won't hurt the economy or the revenues going forward in terms of the pension crisis that we hear a lot about. So I think this is an important contribution and a new line of research that's underway, and we are closely involved with these researchers to see if we can contribute as well. So one of the my favorite conclusion of the study is that it shows that there is little advantage to start the stabilization process now versus 10 years from now. So basically saying that, you hear we gotta do something right now, and that's not really what the data, the analysis of fiscal situation of state and local governments shows in terms of their debt level and their GDP over the next 40 years. I mean, that's what they're talking about. And by then, I think the baby boom generation would have passed through this python. Remember they give an example of baby boom generation passing through a snake, and eventually it will go. So myself included, baby boomers would be no longer the big problem that for social security or for pension, the next generation coming behind us is much smaller. So I think that those are a few of the things I wanted to mention. Various media outlets have covered some of the research I have talked about. For example, pensions and investment has done a number of past 2 years covered both of these uh, publications that I have mentioned. CIO magazine, Chief Investment Officers magazine, has covered these, and I'm beginning to feel there are less attacks as we put out the real data and information on public pension. I have seen fewer uh, compared to 2 or 3 years ago. Every day we would hear something. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over back to Hank.
Thank you, Michael. I think we don't have any questions yet, but one thing I did want to mention to those who are attending, your plan should have gotten a printed version of Peaceful Coexistence. We mailed that out in late October, early November. If you haven't seen it, or if you want additional copies, please send me an email at hank@ncpers, and we're more than happy to send you out the printed version of the report. So, Michael, bottom line, what are sort of the considerations that trustees and administrators should be taking away from your presentation and the Peaceful Coexistence paper?
I think just knowing the facts, we have information for each state in the Peaceful Coexistence publication. When they hear attacks without any evidence or without any data that funding of pensions is causing so much stress on funding for schools or education or other services, then they have the facts to counter that. I think that's the bottom line, not panic, but because the other side hasn't presented any evidence of this crowding out, except some places is anecdotal. And we reviewed the studies that were conducted by those who argue that pension contributions are crowding out public education or other services. And none of those studies really measure up to any credible research. Most of it is based on just no data at all, just unrelated fact. One study talks about teacher salaries haven't increased because of pension contribution, where teacher salaries haven't increased due to many other factors, especially a squeeze on the state and local resources. Uh, so I think having facts in your hand for your own state gives you an upper hand to counter those who attack public pensions that crowding out public education and other services.
Yeah. No, thank you, Michael. And I think your point about the analysis of all 50 states on peaceful coexistence, I think that's a very good point. I will also underscore that the unintended consequences paper that you referenced in this presentation, which talks about the economic stimulus generated by the investments and participant expenditure, there is also a state-by-state analysis in that paper as well. Both of them, again, are available online as well as printed versions. So if you want to take a look at the research, if you want to look at it electronically, please go to ncpers.org, look in the Resource Center, and you will see the publications there. If you want printed copies, please, again, feel free to email either myself or Michael to get the printed versions.
Sure.
At this point, I want to close the webinar by saying that we have two webinars coming up in January. On January 9th, we will do a webinar on revenue raisers and closing loopholes, which is a new report that we will be issuing the 1st of January, as well as our semi-annual legislative webcast, which is going to be on January 14th. If there aren't any questions, I wish everybody a happy holiday season, and thank you very much for tuning in and supporting NCPERS. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.